Re-Zero, Arc 7, Chapter 94, Determination for the Sake of Whom.
A roar, like distant thunder, shook Beatrice's consciousness as she closed her eyelids. Beatrice, such an unpleasant sound, I suppose. The little girl's faint whispering brought back memories of hearing similar sounds over and over again in her mind. 400 years ago, in the Age of Witches, during a time of constant warfare, it was not uncommon for large numbers of people to clash with each other, exchange blows, and fight for their lives. Beatrice was not intimately familiar with the battlefield. She was born and raised in the mansion of her mother, Echidna, a place free from human conflict. Even though the battles were far below her notice, they were still aggravating. As time passed, she spent 400 years with the book entrusted to her, during which the world outside was far from the madness of those days, although it could still be turbulent. Yet, this once far distant madness was now close at hand, that being a struggle for countless lives all around the imperial capital. I am worried. I am anxious. I know how you feel, Shu. I guess you and the others should be leaving too? Oh. Wow. You? That's no good. Our job is to wait. We are waiting. Beatrice, endeavoring to close her eyes and conserve energy, overheard the exchange. What could be heard were the voices of children she had become quite familiar with over the past few days: Schult, Utakata, and Louis Arneb. Beatrice and the other children were settled behind the main camp, where they waited in a tent that overlooked the battlefield from a hill, and although it sounded good to say that they protected the rear of the camp, at least Beatrice knew that this was just a pretense not to be expected of them. Normally, it would be wise to leave non-combatants like children behind in the fortress city. Similarly, the non-combatants among the residents who had relocated from the Demon City with Yorna Mishikia and were unable to survive the battle, stayed away from the front lines and focused on cooperative support like logistics instead. The reason why children did not do the same was because of their guardians. Priscilla, a skirmish is one thing, however, it would be pitiable to keep them at a distance when it comes to the big stage. The fringes of the battlefield shall be acceptable to me. Wherever you may be, you shall not mistake my brilliance. My Zelda, Utakata is one of the Shudrak. Cowards who turn their back on the battlefield and the hunting grounds are not fit to be a member of the Shudrakian people. Naturally, we will not take them to the battlefield. These were the respective statements of Schult and Utakata's guardians, opinions that could not be dissuaded since Schult and Utakata were both highly determined. Both may have spoken from different morals and beliefs, but Beatrice had no right to interfere as long as the parties involved were in agreement for the time being. To be honest, as a great spirit, Beatrice had not been pleased with the situation in which she and these children were being treated as a package. Nevertheless, since everyone in the camp had their own role to play, it was only logical that Beatrice was assigned here considering how restrained her actions were. The role entrusted to her was Louis, Like Schult and Utakata, Louis had also been ordered to stay behind in the tent. Beatrice, except her treatment was distinctly different from that of other young children. Unlike with Schult and Utakata, there was no obvious guardian. However, the main focus was keep an eye on a certain person. Of course, that was the Sin Archbishop. The danger would never diminish, no matter what those who knew her in the Empire said. So, unlike the other children, Louis was the only one they had no choice but to leave behind. Otto, currently, she is a bomb with the least inclination to make a move. Beatrice-chan, I do not wish to burden you too much, but please keep an eye on her. We cannot tell Emilia Summer or Garfield about this, at least we need to remain level-headed, had been Otto's statement before he decided to participate in the full-scale rebellion. It may have been a precaution so that Beatrice would not be discouraged by the helplessness of having no role to play and staying in wait to conserve her energy, but it was also an unsettling statement because she started losing the ground under her feet. The fact that he purposely tried to keep a calm look on his face was unsettling. Both Petra and Frederica had the same concerns, so perhaps they could have done something about it. In any case, Beatrice, you shouldn't fidget around so much. In fact, calm down, I suppose. Utakata, Bay, is awake. Beatrice, Betty has been awake the whole time, in fact. Also, That name you used is unpleasant, I suppose. It kind of makes one feel like they're being accambered. In fact, 1. There were no beds in the camp tent to lie on, and no lap of Emilia nor Petra to borrow either. Consequently, Utakata's lips pouted at Beatrice, who had had her eyes closed as she sat on a simple chair. Opening her eyes thinly at the reaction, she looked at the 3 restless people in the camp. Schelt was anxious, Utakata couldn't handle the fighting spirit, and it was hard to tell what was going in Louis's head as she impatiently bounced her shoulders at each sound of the battle. Beatrice, looking at the behavior alone, there appeared to be nothing suspicious about Louis, a child who was simply hypersensitive to changes in her surroundings. Other carefree people, who were unaware of the threat of gluttony, would have inadvertently regarded them as a normal child, but that was not the case for Beatrice. Beatrice, Emilia and everyone else are doing their best to help Subaru and the others, I suppose. The reason Emilia and her group were willing to intervene in this rebellion and fight for their lives, despite having no obligation to do so, was that they were likely to find their friends, Subaru and Rem, there. If Beatrice was unable to fight alongside them, she would at least be able to cut down on distractions by keeping a close eye on Louis. So, Beatrice braced herself through shallow breathing and, Louis, you? Beatrice, you, what are you up to? In fact, Beatrice's lips pursed, as a small hand caressed her head. She glanced at Louis, who was looking at her with lowered eyebrows. For a moment, her body stiffened at the risk of being touched by Louis's hand, but she did not feel threatened by her, nor did Louis make any gesture to snatch Beatrice's name away. As far as Beatrice knew, gluttony required calling out the other person's name and eating it in order to activate the authority, but Louis' mouth never even uttered the right sounds to begin with. Of course, if Louis only required awareness, there was still a possibility for her to activate the authority, so Beatrice was nervous about Louis moving the hand that touched her head to her mouth. If Louis ever showed the slightest gesture to eat Beatrice's name, then, Utakata, Bay, your face is scary. Do you still hate Lou? Beatrice, what a way to comment on Betty's adorable face, I suppose. Besides, Betty does not hate this girl. In fact, despising would be more fitting, I suppose. At the sight of Beatrice glaring at Louis, Utakata pushed up both of her own eyes with her fingers while saying her face isn't adorable, and Beatrice let her true feelings come out in the end. So yes, I find myself hating Louis, not just Louis, but the Sin Archbishop of Gluttony in general. Everything that caused Subaru and the others to suffer. Beatrice, regretful, in fact, for the Emilia camp, and above all for Subaru. Gluttony's biggest victim had been none other than Rem. Watching Subaru suffer over the girl who was indefinitely asleep, made Beatrice constantly regret the time wasted before she had been contracted with him, when she was indifferent to the world around her, wondering what could have been. If Beatrice had opened up earlier and shown a willingness to cooperate with Subaru and others, things might have turned out differently. Not allowing the White Whale, the witch cult, and the like to do whatever they wanted, Subaru would not have ended up displaying such a never-ending expression of sorrow beside Rem as she continued to sleep. That was why she decided to never let Subaru suffer like that again, and stay by his side for the rest of his life. Yet here she was. After being separated from Subaru, she could not help Emilia and the other members of the group to the fullest extent because she was forced to conserve energy. The meaning of her existence was in tatters. Schelt, Beatrice-chan, you can't talk like that to Louis Summer. Beatrice, Betty doesn't feel sorry for her, I suppose. You're being imprudent to begin with, in fact. Why do you refer to Betty as Chan when the others are called Summer, I suppose? You lack respect, in fact. Schelt, ugh. I'm terribly sorry, Beatrice-chan. Picking up a sense of danger, Schelt interjected as she stared at him. How did Schelt, who did not waver despite being terrified, see Beatrice? Could it be that he thought she was a little girl since she had been asleep all this time? Beatrice, in any case, do not fatigue Betty, I suppose. The whole purpose of being left here is to prevent everyone here from doing anything unnecessary. In fact, as much as a pain it is to do exactly that. Louis, you, Beatrice, it is much better than letting you run amok, I suppose. Beatrice grabbed Louis's hand resting on her head and made the startled Louis sit down in the chair right next to her. In the end, She decided to hold on to Louis's hand and not let go of it. Beatrice, you too, in fact. Schult, stop moping around, and Utakata, if you do not have anything to do, just take care of your bow, I suppose. So, ? It appears that there is no need for me to interject. Beatrice, what? As she was dealing with the restless children, she suddenly heard a calm voice enter the camp tent. When she looked, she saw a man with curly hair, Zika Osman, peeking inside. Beatrice furrowed her brow at his appearance since he was supposed to be at the main camp, commanding alongside Abel. Utakata, Z. We've been busy, but now you're here. It's time for you and the others. Beatrice, you wish, in fact. But what business do you have, I suppose? Zika, my apologies Miss Utakata, but it's not your time. However, there is a possibility that we may move the camp at a later date, so I thought I would let you know in advance. Schult, moving the camp, you say? Zika's intellectual, round eyes made Schult tilt his head. Zika nodded yes in response, as he pointed at the battlefield behind him. Zika, currently, we are devoting our forces to breaching the city walls, but once a bastion has been opened, we will venture forth to the Crystal Palace in the imperial capital. At that time, the commander must also go to the front. Beatrice, Abel does not seem capable of fighting, in fact. He is safer in the rear, concentrating on giving orders, I suppose. Zika, you are right. However, then the troops will not follow us. In the case of us paving the way for His Excellency the Emperor, then no one would allow him to sit on the throne. Beatrice. Such bothersome national ideals. In fact, the fundamental principle of the Wallachian Empire was that the people of the empire should be strong. However, this apparently applied even to a leader fetching a nation. If the supreme leader does not boast any strength, they will be overthrown by their subordinates in the blink of an eye. Zika, yes, it's bothersome. But that is what our homeland is about. Shaking his head gently, a slightly wry smile appeared on Zika's mouth. It was hard for Beatrice to discern what emotions were being mixed in there. He may not have been entirely comfortable with it, but neither was he negative about it. Schult, Zika-sama, could it be you are heading into battle? Utakata, Z. Suddenly, beside Beatrice, who was watching Zika's lips, Schult asked him a question, while Utakata called out to him in a quiet voice. At the children's gaze, Zika raised his eyebrows slightly, then, Zika, as you have guessed, I will also be participating. Even though we outnumber them, we are still at a disadvantage in terms of generals below general second class, so we have to change that situation. Beatrice, why is that, I suppose? Zika, dash? Pardon, Beatrice, why do you bother to come here, in fact? In your position, you could have just ordered your men to do it, I suppose. What purpose is there in you showing up in front of Betty and the others, in fact? Zika, oh, that's what you mean. If one was about to head into battle, one would want to be even more focused at this point in time. Nevertheless, Zika showed up at a camp tent full of children, who could not be left behind on this battlefield. When he was asked his reason, Zika put up an embarrassed smile. Zika, there are only men at the main camp since the women of Shudrak are also on the front line. If we are in need of encouragement before going into battle, only women can make you truly exhilarated. Beatrice, huh? Schult, I see. Certainly, Utakata-sama and Louis-sama are here, as well as Beatrice-chan. Hearing his unexpected answer, Beatrice's eyes widened. In contrast to Beatrice's reaction, Schult looked convinced, and Utakata nodded with her short arms folded. Then she turned to the astonished Beatrice and said, Utakata, give it up. Z, it's been like this from the start. Beatrice, it was a big mistake to think this guy was the only normal one, I suppose. The signs were there. For some reason, he was called a coward, and instead of trying to argue about it, he was proud of it. However, there was no reason for her to get deeply involved, so she just didn't say anything. As a result, Zika's eccentricities ended up on display at the last minute, with it resulting in an awkward situation. Zika, besides, if you are aware of what is behind you, you have a better chance of not getting lost. Beatrice. You have a family, in fact, Zika, a mother and numerous sisters. But when I joined this side, their position became much worse. It's a terrible misfortune for my family. Zika was originally a general on the side of the empire as a general second class. Since he defected, it was only natural that his family would be affected. Zika was prepared for that and still considered it worthwhile to choose this side. Beatrice wondered if Abel was worthy of this choice, but no one but the man himself knew the reasons. She was simply curious. Beatrice, what is it you fight for, I suppose? Zika, Beatrice, you are not supposed to be like those guys who fight for the sake of fighting, in fact. Why is that, I suppose? A simple soldier may have been fine with this, which made the Wallachian Empire such a terrifying place since many of its warriors were of a similar mindset, but that was not the case for a general, much less Zika. At Beatrice's perception, Zika raised a thick eyebrow in slight contemplation. Then, Zika, of course, it is for the sake of the future of the Wallachian Empire for which I place my faith and to which I owe my loyalty. With a strong voice, he replied, and then he continued with, of course, Zika, I am a coward, after all, so I doubt I could resist. So, may I ask you, Miss Beatrice, what, in fact, Zika, the obvious. The blessing of a lovely maiden. As he said this, Zika pulled out the sword from his side and presented it to Beatrice. After narrowing her eyes and looking down at the proffered item, Beatrice sighed and, Beatrice, for the record, Betty does not know much about the proper etiquette, I suppose. Zika, in such matters the feelings are what's most important. As long as the giver and the receiver's hearts are in tune with each other, the etiquette is of no significance. Beatrice, since when are our hearts in tune with each other, in fact? Good grief, muttering, Beatrice accepted the sword. In front of Beatrice, Zika reverently dropped his head and kneeled down. His seriousness reminded Beatrice of a ceremony she had attended one day when Subaru was knighted by Emilia, and she followed her example. With the sword she received, she tapped each of the kneeling Zika's shoulders once. Beatrice, to see this through properly, I suppose. For the sake of no one else's but your own wish, Zika, as you command. At Beatrice's blessing, Zika looked up in somber acknowledgement. He sheathed the sword returned to him by Beatrice and looked towards Utakata and the others by his side. Seeing the look in his eyes, Utakata called out, Utakata, you is a Shudrakian warrior, so we don't do things like bay. A send-off in the style of a warrior. As she said that, Utakata pulled out the knife from her waist. With the knife made from the tusk of a beast she cut a thin slice of skin from her palm to cause a small bleeding. Beside Schultz's pained face, Utakata gently pressed her blood-soaked palm against the armor Zika wore, marking it with her handprint. Utakata, Shudrakian blood, the blood of strong warriors. Make Z strong, too. Zika, with gratitude, Schultz, well, I can't think of anything like Beatrice-chan or Utakata-sama, so I'll cheer for you. Hooray! Hooray! Zika-sama. I'll be there. In response to Utakata's action, Schultz also shouted a loud cheer to Zika. Zika accepted it with a smile and stood up in place, and then, Zika, Louis, Louis slipped out of Beatrice's hands and hugged Zika's waist as he stood up. Zika was startled by the little girl's embrace, as he patted her on the shoulder with a frown. In Beatrice's eyes, Louis' behavior was an indication of positive feelings towards Zika. The fact that she could not control her at a moment's notice was also because there was no sign of unpleasantness. Zika Osman, as I depart for battle. Please, remain in good health. Schultz, may you have success in battle. Breaking free from Louis' embrace, Zika exited the tent with a cheerful look on his face. Schultz waved his hand, while Utakata narrowed her eyes as they watched him go. As Beatrice watched Zika's back grow distant, she understood that he headed into battle fully prepared to die. Just like it was the case 400 years ago, when war was happening in faraway places. However, there were frequent visitors to her mother's mansion, and they all sought the witch's knowledge and cooperation. All with a strong desire to improve bad situations. That being noted, it was up to every single person to realize whatever advice one received from the knowledgeable. After seeing the possibilities within the future of her mother's advice, many turned their backs on the mansion and headed toward their own futures. Zika's back appeared to be just like ones from that time. Beatrice, you, Louis, you? Watching Zika leave, Beatrice addressed Louis. Turning around, Louis stared back at Beatrice with her already wide eyes becoming more wide upon her childish face. Completely thoughtless, no, that would be a mistake. Yet, looking at her face, which seemed to be devoid of any plan, she asked, Beatrice, which side are you really on, in fact? HK, with a full swing, the pair of ice swords struck her chest, and Madeline, her eyes wide open, flew a great deal backwards. As Emilia chased after her, she called out thank you to the beings that prevented Madeline's movement to the sculptures of Natsuki Subaru made from ice. To fight alongside the 7 soldiers of ice was a tactic Emilia had developed as a last resort when she had taken Vulcanica's trial at the Pleiades watchtower. On her own, she may have lacked manpower. Without time to waste on her vague apprehensions, these ice soldiers were the result brought about by her confidence that I've been watching Subaru closely. She intended on using their official names when she showed them to Subaru. Emilia, so for now, just do your best as soldiers. There was no direct reply to Emilia's words, but one by one, the 7 ice soldiers pumped their fists up, giving a response to Emilia's cheers. While she thought of that reassuringly, Emilia and the ice soldiers drew near Madeline, who had been blown away. It probably looked just like a scene where 8 people were bullying a small girl, but, Madeline, if one were to see the howling Madeline swinging her arms, blowing away the upper bodies of 2 ice soldiers, such a leisurely impression probably would not come to mind. Even without her flying winged blade, Madeline's dragon claws and superhuman strength were exceedingly frightening. Emilia's ice had been made hard and firm, and even if it was not to the extent of iron, it was at least as hard as a strong boulder. If one were to carelessly strike it barehanded, it was hard enough to reasonably break their hand instead. It was so easily destroyed by a mere scratch of Madeline's fingers. Emilia, I'm sorry. The soldiers resembling Subaru were destroyed, and Emilia could hear the screams of Beatrice in her mind. Apologizing to the Beatrice inside her head, Emilia remained vigilant for Madeline's counteroffensive. While she was vigilant, she chose not to back down, but instead to continue stepping forward. Emilia, Yeah. Terra, brandishing her pair of ice swords, she proceeded to rain down attacks on Madeline, who had not perished from the force of the initial strike. Although, when the pair of swords struck the shoulders of Madeline, her arms widespread, they shattered into pieces. The tough skin of the dragonkin remained unyielding to the sword slashes of ice. She needed to use even heavier attacks. Emilia, with this, the shattered pair of swords became shards of ice, and what Emilia had made to replace them was a large ice mallet. As Emilia brandished it, 2 of the kneeling ice soldiers linked arms to create a foothold before her eyes, then she stepped on that and jumped up high. Gaining speed immediately after, Emilia drove the ice mallet into Madeline with enough force to make her own body spin vertically. Madeline, HK, without any defense, Madeline received Emilia's blow directly on her head. Landing before Madeline, who had turned downwards as of the impact, Emilia used the recoil to put power into a second strike. Emilia, as soon as she gripped it tightly, the handle of the ice mallet shattered. No, it was not just the handle, the entire thing had been destroyed. The ice mallet that had struck Madeline's head was the one unable to bear the opponent's hardness. Emilia widened her eyes upon seeing that, and simultaneously, the claws below her eyes rose sharply. The moment the claws moved within the edges of her vision, a small shield of ice intercepted its trajectory. Emilia, ow! However, the ice shield was smashed at that instant, and cries of pain erupted. After having poured energy into her body at an earned moment, the side of her head was slashed by the claw tips, and at the slight impact of her silver hair being grazed, Emilia's vision greatly and violently shook. Nevertheless, the attack did not end with that. Madeline, do not mock this dragon. The howling Madeline raised her claws overhead. The wind of destruction that followed turned over the surface of the ground. Emilia promptly flew backwards and avoided the claws, but if she had been too late and basked in that wind, her body would have been greatly snapped in return. Engulfed in the wave motion of the ground turning over, Emilia's body bounced, and was blown away. Emilia, Rururuyu, with eyes just like those of a dragon or a snake, Madeline caught up and raised her flying winged blade overhead. As it swung down, it accelerated with aim for Emilia's lower back. In an instant, Emilia funneled power into her abdomen to try and withstand the oncoming strike, but she immediately concluded that it was something that she must not be hit by. Reaching out her hand, she tightly grasped a cold and solid sensation. Emilia, her arm was jerked up with force, and Emilia's body, now having been pulled up, escaped the trajectory of the flying winged blade. The one which had done that was an ice soldier who caught up to the blown away Emilia as fast as it could, and pulled her arm while diving into a forward somersault. The ice soldier forcibly pulled Emilia up, and heaved her away just after. Emilia's body spun around as it was sent flying, and in her field of vision, the ice soldier was overpowered and shattered by the flying winged blade which she had evaded. Emilia, Subaru. It was not Subaru, but Emilia had called out with the feeling that Subaru had received harm. Catching up to Emilia, who had again been sent flying, was an ice soldier different to the one which had been destroyed. Without a pause, she was thrown over to the next ice soldier, received, then thrown over, and was escaping from the dragonkin. Madeline, enough. Quit messing around. With an angry bellow and a flash, the solid earth fissured where it had been stepped on by Madeline, her face red, and with her firm foothold, she threw the flying winged blade with a tremendous and ferocious vigor. The flying winged blade revolved at a velocity so intense and extreme that to the eye, it did not appear as anything but a disc. It was a disc that cut down anything and everything in its path, and clad in a strong wind, it approached Emilia. Emilia, I'm counting on you. Before that could reach her, the ice soldiers, receiving Emilia's voice, rushed out one by one. They lined up in single file, and wedged themselves into the gap between the flying Emilia and the disc flying towards her. All of them took an ice weapon in their hands, and used them to fight against the flying winged blade. As a result, the sounds of ice shattering at high speed chained together, and the Subaru ice soldiers were completely annihilated. However, just before each Subaru was shattered, they each landed as much of a hit as they could onto the flying winged blade. The change in the danger of the flying winged blade was something that ordinary people would not know, but that Revolution had very slightly, just a little, a wee bit, weakened. She felt like it had weakened. Emilia, It weakened, she declared it in a loud voice, and it truly appeared like it had become like that. Using the leeway that the ice Subarus had made for her, Emilia equipped her legs with thick-soled ice boots, placed the two arms of her midair body on the ground, and met the oncoming flying winged blade with her two legs. Emilia was well aware that legs were just a little stronger than arms. Emilia, ya. Firmly clenching her teeth, Emilia extended her knees using all of her might. The direct impact from the flying winged blade delivered a shock to Emilia's entire body, and from head to toe, all the bones in her body were creaking. Firmly withstanding, she would withstand it to the end, fully extending her legs, which were experiencing resistance, even while crevices started to form in her ice boots. Emilia's kick shot the flying winged blade up into the sky. Madeline, it seemed like it was beyond Madeline's expectations for it to have been stopped, so she raised her voice in surprise. Facing that, Emilia got up and leapt, reaching her hand out to the flying winged blade which had been kicked up. She tightly grasped the edge of the flying winged blade, and into that arm, she poured a considerable amount of strength. Emilia, this time. I'm returning the favor. The flying winged blade was much heavier than it looked, but Emilia was also someone who possessed indomitable power. It was difficult with a single arm, so she twisted her body in order to change to a two-handed grip. From there, with all her might, she resolutely flung the flying winged blade away with a hiya. Madeline, HK. Seeing the flying winged blade flung away, Madeline widened her eyes, receiving the vigor of rapid spinning. The flying winged blade soared. Although it looked unfavorable when compared to when Madeline had thrown it, the dangerous weapon still cut through the wind as it flew. Flying towards an incorrect direction, it had flown away amazingly. Emilia, Madeline, just what is your intention? Emilia, I may have messed up. She was trying to return the favor and deal damage, but she was completely unable to handle the flying winged blade well, so it had flown away. On the forehead of Madeline, who had been angered by that, a vein had begun to bulge very quickly. Immediately after, Madeline's cheeks stiffened, and she stepped forward in order to chase after the flying winged blade which had flown away. However, Emilia, that's a no-no. Then, Emilia, her hands outstretched, created a wall of ice ahead of where Madeline was proceeding. The wall of ice erected from the ground was thick, and she had also made it fairly long lengthwise. Going around it or jumping over it, neither feat would be managed so easily. She was not able to use the flying winged blade very well, but it would be dangerous for Madeline to wield it. It was not as though that was her aim, but she thought that the current situation of it being at a distance was the most beneficial. Emilia, I'm sorry, but I can't let you retrieve that weapon. If you are to continue, then it shall be without that. Madeline, Emilia, if you surrender, I will properly accept that. Actually, if you do that, it would be really helpful. What will you do? Will you continue? Emilia posed a question to the back of Madeline, who cast her eyes downward as she faced the wall of ice. If Madeline, who had lost her weapon, were to surrender, that would be the best scenario. In order to get Madeline to believe she was at a disadvantage, Emilia once again created the Natsuki subrus of ice, which had once been annihilated, in her surroundings, and she crossed her arms as she stood, 8 against 1. This time, in a state without her weapon, Madeline was in a much more unfavorable position. With all this, then, Emilia was enthusiastically thinking as such. But alas, Madeline, why do you think that I, the dragon, would give up? Muttering, Madeline gently placed her hand on the wall of ice before her eyes. Gazing at that gesture, Emilia reflexively caught her breath with an ah. With a crack, the very moment that high-pitched noise reverberated, the entirety of the gigantic ice wall began to fissure with the pattern of a spiderweb. The origin was naturally Madeline's palm, so the fissures that extended across the entire ice wall were centered on her. Emilia had gone all out when creating that ice wall. The hardness and density of the ice were just as previously mentioned, and even though it was not something that could be destroyed easily, Emilia, Madeline, Madeline, when talking to you humans, this dragon's head gets all weird. You, that healer, that senile old fool, all of you are in this dragon's way. Emilia, turning her back, without revealing her downcast face, mixed into Madeline's trembling voice were complex and intricate emotions. Anger, sorrow, and all sorts of other things. It seemed just as if Madeline herself did not understand which of her own emotions was the strongest. What she had spoken of were those who were in her way. Of course, Emilia understood that she herself was in a position confronting Madeline. Outside of Emilia, the ones she called a healer and a senile old fool, did they also happen to be her enemies? As a dragonkin, as an ally of the Empire, Madeline opposed Emilia and the others, and went on a rampage. Emilia, Madeline, for what purpose do you fight? Madeline, at the question, Madeline swayed her head to a tilt, her two black horns at a slant. Madeline's golden eyes stared at Emilia from above her shoulders. Though she was getting a horrifying, blood-curdling sensation, Emilia did not avert her gaze. Going against the instinct to turn away, Emilia fixed her eyes on Madeline. Thinking about it now, she should have done it sooner. She should have tried to talk like this from the very start, both this time and last time, even though Madeline, who was blocking in the way, had been brimming with fighting spirit. Emilia had gotten caught up in it, and suddenly begun an attack. But, Emilia, if we can talk with each other, then I really think that talking is the best scenario. Madeline, why do you fight? For the sake of whom? Madeline, what about you? Why? Emilia, wondering if it would really be necessary to say that, Emilia realized that Madeline was trying to continue. The fact that she had responded with that was something very difficult for Emilia. The reason that Madeline had given Emilia something she must speak of, that unfortunate occurrence, was something which Emilia could not be prepared for. If Emilia were to refuse her dialogue, and if the result of that refusal was claws being swung, Emilia would wield an ice weapon as expected, and would need to oppose Madeline. In that manner, upon Emilia's cheeks stiffening, Madeline, why do you oppose? Opposing this dragon, there is no chance for victory. Emilia, Madeline, why? do you? Why do all of you oppose? That was the question posed from Madeline's side. Unknowing of Emilia's circumstances, she responded as such to words she should have brushed off. On the contrary, being questioned about that, Emilia cautioned her own slow mind. She thought she could not respond with anything. However, it was not like that. Just as Madeline had said, if Emilia could not get Madeline to speak, then she herself should be the one to open up her heart first. After all, this battlefield was harsh, so Emilia prioritized the things she herself wanted to do, and the things she herself wanted to say. But even so, at just this moment, for what reason did she think to try and have good manners? Why did she fight? For what reason was she here? The answer to all of that was, Emilia, I came here to meet my treasured knight. No, everybody's treasured knight. Saying that, Emilia touched the shoulder of one of the ice soldiers, the imitations of Subaru, directly next to her. She thought she had made them well. She had replicated his hairstyle and tracksuit quite proficiently, though, no matter how well they imitated him, Subaru's reliability could not be reproduced. His positive words, his reliable attitude, his kindness which gave her delight, just about everything. Natsuki Subaru-ness, just thinking about it made Emilia's chest grow pleasantly warm, and it was impossible for anyone except the person in question to possess Emilia. He's a really treasured person. That person, and the girl who should be with that person, many people are awaiting their return, so that's why I am here. For that purpose, I'm trying my very best. Madeline, Emilia, the reason I fight, that's it. Madeline, what about you? She probably had someone, or something, which she wanted to protect. If that was the case, they could make a promise to not hurt the other's treasured thing, and they could probably stop fighting. Subaru and Rem, it would open the path to reach the two who she wished to bring back. Those hopes and wishes that Emilia held were Madeline, Borleroy to Meglyph. Emilia, that name is? Madeline, that was the name of the man who was to be this dragon's husband. He is this dragon's entire reason for fighting. They were betrayed by Madeline, who fought for the sake of someone who had already been lost. Emilia, hearing her voice lose all spirit, Emilia caught her breath. She was unable to find the right words to say at the spur of the moment, and because she was not close enough to reach her hand out, Emilia could not make it in time. For that reason, Madeline, kill the man who killed Borleroy. That is this dragon's long-standing desire. A violent sound rang out, as Madeline crushed the ice wall with her grip. There was no other way to describe it than crushed it with her grip. She tightened her grip with the hand placed on the wall, and from there, the destruction spread throughout the entire ice wall. It had been shattered in one fell swoop. Taking the flying winged blade present on the other side, Madeline looked to the figure facing her once more, and while Emilia digested those bitter feelings, she and the ice soldiers headed towards Madeline. Having lost someone dear to her, the Dragonkin girl was desperate to fill the empty hole in chest. Stepping forward to chase her, that was the moment. Madeline met Sorai facing the sky as she bathed in the fragments of the shattered ice wall. Madeline cried out, as though it was ripping apart the sparkling ice shards as they danced down. The loud voice echoed throughout the sky of skies. Hearing that, Emilia's eyes grew wide, and she looked to the sky. The sound Madeline had made, Emilia had heard it once before. Her lips had previously spun that sound, and at the time when it was spun, at that time, there was a really big attack. A white corona rained down incessantly, and mowing down the fortress city in the blink of an eye. The very terrain had been altered. Since Emilia was together with Priscilla at that time, they were somehow able to defend against it. Supposing the same thing happened here, Emilia wondered if she would be able to stand a chance against it on her own. That would be very difficult. Above the head of the panicked Emilia, the same thing did not occur. However, despite the fact that the same thing had not occurred, Emilia could not greatly rejoice. After all, I am Mazoya. In accordance with the voice of mine dear child, I shalt become the wind from the heavenly skies, spreading its wings of pure white, a body of colossal scale, clad in the very essence of an overcast sky. The cloud dragon Mazoya, invoked by Madeline Eschart, swooped down upon the skies of the imperial capital.